if at every instant we may perish, so that at every instant we may be saved. Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth. Part 3. Between. 23. Here we are now on the outskirts of this nowhere city. Even after all we've been through, we're still wandering, still lost. Here are the thoughts that pass through our head as we walk on these lonely, endless streets. Did we really think that barren our problems are going to make them disappear? How adorably naive we were. Clearly that was not the case. That is never the case. Did we think this journey we were forced into going to was going to reveal something meaningful about humanity? Or at the very least reveal to us something meaningful about ourselves? Give me a break. That's not how this works. This is fiction. A story. It's all fake. He dug a hole in his backyard and ended up burying himself? Come on, even that metaphor is trite. There's no subtlety to it. It's overwrought and obvious. It's pulp. It's hack. This whole thing is the work of a hack. I mean, look at it. Look at these stupid words. Can you people not put it together anymore? I'm not even trying to hide it. I've done away with any pretense of authorial detachment, just switched over to the first-person perspective. This book is my whole. This book is all about me. I once heard an author I really respect talking about how it's the responsibility of the writer to not waste their readers' time. How in writing as a trade we should be mindful of our audience and the fact that they decide to invest time in our art. As such, the people who picked up this book didn't do so to hear my story. Nobody cares about my story. They're reading this book to hear their story through somebody else's eyes. You, the reader, are supposed to be the main character here, not me, the creator. But the thing I'm struggling with is this. How the hell am I supposed to tell your story? Where would I even start? How could I possibly know if this story has been about you at all? I don't know you, and when I try to think about who you may be, you appear to me as faint and elusive as the worm woman first appeared to Harrison. To me, you are an abstract notion, a giant blur, and in that blur, you could be any of the 8 billion other people on this planet, each one with their own hopes, their own struggles. There's no way I could possibly narrow that down into something you might find relatable. Because maybe you're not like me. Maybe we have nothing in common. Maybe you've got it all together. Maybe you've never once questioned any of your relationships, or your job, or your life, or anything. Maybe you like books to be light, fluffy reads. Maybe you picked up this novel because you were looking to simply be entertained. And that's totally fine by me. I do not have a problem with that. I like to be entertained too. But how am I supposed to know how to entertain you when you've never once made a wrong turn and you're just so very happy? And here I am, the only son of a bitch in the entire universe who feels forced to accept responsibility like it was the goddamn noose around his neck. Makes me wonder, how much neurosis can I cram into one book before anyone knows what I'm doing? And now look at this, I'm not trying to hide anymore. I've fallen off the wagon completely. This isn't a story, this is a journal entry. This is terrible. And oh god, what is my wife going to say when she reads this manuscript? I haven't even considered the fact that she's going to read this thing when it goes to print. Will she understand I'm merely trying to explore the darker side of relationships of normalcy? Like we should all be so fucking happy that everything turned out okay, we can even consider the life we've been living to be okay? Or will she take this personally? Will she scream at me? Beg me not to publish it? Worse, will she divorce me or murder me in my sleep? Will my editor keep this self-indulgent, fourth-wall-breaking diatribe in the final draft? And speaking of final drafts, how the fuck am I gonna end this thing? I can see my word count in the document I'm typing this up in. I can see it going up with every new sentence. I can see a little mark on my calendar indicating my approaching deadline. I know we've entered the third act. We're quickly coming up on the ending, and it's time to land this rickety old plane of a novel on the runway. But how? Despite everything we've been through and everything I've just said, I don't want to waste your time. I need to make all this bullshit pay off without relying on one of those tacked on, happily ever after type endings. Because the moment after that type of book, at that type of ending, or when this book began, and I don't want to leave you with a contrived and oversimplified moral like love conquers all, or some other type of unctuous nonsense. I want it to feel real, and I want you to feel it too. So to that end, no more of this meta-analysis stuff. It's distracting. Just the story, cut and dry, from here on out, until we're done. Under the ground, Harrison wandered the city. His whole body had become more and more plant-like, and adversely, less and less human, with each luxurious step. Mixed in with the leaves and foliage were a few odd fingers he had somehow begun to regenerate. Not a hand exactly, not even close. He wasn't going to be slapping anyone high five anytime soon, but somewhere amid the meat and vegetation beneath his skin, a mass of fingers had sprouted too, like carrots, and were using the surging rush of flora to push their way to the surface. He didn't know when this transformation would end, if it would end. Heck, he didn't know if it was even a transformation at all. This could all be the symptoms of a new and strange fever, a temporary necrosis, a case of the sniffles, and it would soon pass. Perhaps this all had been a dream the whole time, or hallucination, or the protracted and eternal flash that the terminal man may have passed before his eyes. Of course, this was all wishful thinking on Harrison's part. What he wouldn't give for a simple fatal disease right about now. He knew this was no mere hallucination, nor was it a symbolic projection of a fever dream. This shit was real, a fact no more evidenced than by the anguish of Tabitha Moss, who had been pulled down here to suffer too, independent of any other explanation that crossed Harrison's mind. She was wandering the city just as Harrison did, but from the opposite end. Both she and her husband had no specific destination they were headed. Everything was lost. The insects infesting this city paid these two humans no more mind than a human would normally pay to a bug. If any acknowledgement was made, it was done with disinterest. Still, the closer they got to downtown, the more awake the city seemed to become. Worms hustled and bustled about. Some wore neckties, even though they had no necks, and some carried briefcases, even though they had no arms. Other worms ran shops and newsstands, serving up piles of warm, putrid trash the way a vendor might serve a hot dog. Tourist worms took pictures of the large, crumbling building and what appeared to be broken cameras. Near the alleyways, there were worms who were clearly derelict, even though everything down here was covered in dirt, hustling for spare change. There was a worm analog for every type of person you'd come across in the world topside. The seed in Tabitha's stomach was doing things to her body too, just like it was doing things to her husband's, though not nearly as dramatic. Not yet. For now, a malaise settled over her as she trudged through this nightmare world alone. Such is malaise, and such is loneliness. And as Harrison wandered, he came upon a store that he thought might help. It had helped him in the past, though the man he was then, the man he was now, were more just separate as they were two random souls you could compare. Big and orange and square, this store was like a cartoon castle. It stood by itself in a massive parking lot, an island in a sea of tar. It was a Home Depot under the ground. Harrison thought it was odd that Home Depot would choose to put a location here, but he supposed insects, like the creatures of the firma above, sometime needed tools and supplies too. Still, he wondered silently to himself, what use could a worm have for a hammer? Harrison went inside the hardware store. His plan was to purchase some pruning shears. He wanted to trim back some of these branches growing out of his skin and try and keep himself mobile for as long as possible. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than nothing. Each step was getting harder. His feet were roots ready to unfurl, trying to hold him in place. He walked around the Home Depot, the aisles and rows like ramparts, like the walls of the dome that surrounded this city. It was as suffocating in the store as it was outside of it. Worms pushed orange carts with wobbly wheels and shopped like it was normal Sunday and they needed to buy some plywood or a chandelier-style light fixture. Harrison ignored them, and they ignored him. And when he happened across the aisle that on the end cap read ropes, he paused. Something about all this seemed so tragically familiar. He went down the aisle and stopped in front of the row of braided rope spools. He thought about the first time he was here, all those years ago, on the day that Tabitha went from a faceless stranger to an inescapable part of his life. Everything was different from then on out. Do you know I was here on the day that we met? A voice suddenly said. He turned his head to the side, and there she was, Tabitha, standing next to him. He felt like he hadn't seen her in decades. Perhaps it had been that long. Do you know why I was in this aisle in particular? Standing right here in front of the ropes? I suspect it was the same reason I was, Harrison said. You were planning on hanging yourself. She sighed as if she'd just been exonerated from some long-held confession. Sometimes being a person is just so damn hard, you know? I thought your love was going to save me, he said. I thought that was all there was. That's what these stories teach us, right? That if we're good people, then we fall in love and get a happy ending because that's what good people deserve. We played by the rules and did everything right. And yet here we are. It didn't change a thing. I was still the same as I was on the inside. I know, she said. I thought your love would save me too. I had nothing else. Were we ever in love? Is such a thing impossible? I've asked myself that countless times before. That day, the one when I swallowed the seed, cut off my hand, and started digging this bottomless hole. I was in the backyard, mowing the lawn. It was a day like the days that preceded it. Normal as it gets, and then, I don't know, Tabs, I felt it. I felt all the weight of that time piling up on top of me. I needed to do something about it, something drastic. I needed to destroy it all, or run away, or rebuild it, or something. I needed to try. How can I possibly get you to understand emotions so imprecise and convoluted? She didn't reply. Not with big, swooping proclamations of forgiveness, nor with ire or condemnation. She didn't drop the L word because that would cheapen this moment with and reduce it to kish. Instead, she merely reached out and took a hold of the roots hanging off the end of his wrist into the palm of her hand. I understand, she softly said. He looked up at her. In her eyes he could see it, inside of her, working its way through her veins. You ate a seed too? She nodded. What is it doing to you? I don't know yet. But it didn't really matter. His heart thundered in his chest, each palpitation sending a wave of euphoria through him. Her nostrils flared, their bodies ran hot, with desire and lust. You're here with me now, he said. I am. So you know what you have to do then, he said. She nodded again. He didn't have to say anything else. This is going to get gross. Yes, this is going to get weird. Because sometimes love is gross and weird. And sometimes love is tender and soft. And sometimes love is terrifying and violent. And sometimes love is all these things all at once, especially when the seeds inside your body are flowering and flourishing and looking for a way to push themselves out. Sometimes love is not a thing that comes to you like a gift from the gods, but something you have to discover, fight for, and earn. Sometimes it hibernates deep within, and when it finally wakes up, it's ready to burn hotter than all the stars in the sky combined. For the first time in a long time, perhaps for the first time in their entire relationship, both Harrison and Tabitha let passion take over. And right there, in the middle of this hardware store, surrounded by tools and the bugs and the dirt and decay and the blood and the plants and everything else that made this whole disgusting universe spin round, Harrison laid his wife down like the floor were as pride as their honeymoon bed, and he climbed on top of his bride. His skin split open, a fissure that ran from his belly button down past the crest of his perium, opening up ever so slightly like the parting of barn doors, physically hurt him. You couldn't see it on his face as he bit his lip and cried green tears. The pain caused him to inhale sharply, furrow his brow, wince, and out from this newly formed hole in his body wormed a singular root, thick and long, throbbing and phallic. Tabitha was breathing hard too as his root pressed up against her groin. Her chest was pumping up and down, in and out, nervous and excited and a little afraid all at the same time. She too opened up, spreading wide and letting it in, and lordy, it was painful for her too. Gap between her legs appearing as if it were a peach pulled apart by invisible hands. She grimaced, eyes water, breath seized. The two of them, without the means for a desire for so long, their genitals previously healed away like vestigial organs evolved out of two ravenous beasts, but now re-evolved, exploding forth, unable to be suppressed or circumvented, human biology coming full circle in the most unchaste way. It was happening in all its gooey glory, and my God, it couldn't have possibly been any more poetic than the moment the two of them finally lovingly embraced and tenderly, earnestly, finally had sex again. Right there on the Home Depot floor. 24. Perhaps, in the world above, an act of indecency such as the act that Harrison and Tabitha had just committed on the floor might be cause for arrest. At the very least, they would have been kicked out of the store. But here in the underground, amongst the creatures who thrive in the filth, nobody even batted an eyelash. Nobody even had eyelashes. Hidden within their aching and amorous bodies, the middle of all that frenzied lovemaking, something was exchanged between them, not just emotionally, though that too seemed to reach its logicative and purgative end, but physically. They both feel it. The logic, the seed that had been born out of the spleen fruit and was passed back and forth clandestinely through their loins, and this seed got to work doing what seeds do best: pollinating, fertilizing, inseminating, growing. Isn't that what sex really is anyway? A simple transfer of seeds? Tabitha's stomach swelled up almost immediately, round like a beach ball, blue veins hugging the sides of her distended skin, belly button popped outward like a turkey thermometer. She was suddenly pregnant. Very pregnant. Despite the fact that the post-orgasmic serotonin still swirling through their brains left them feeling like they were the only two people in the world, there was one other creature who would certainly pay attention to this carnal deed. It watched, wordless, from an aisle away. The last time we were in here, in the Home Depot, when Harrison and Tabitha first met all those years ago, we were the only ones who were watching. They had no idea. We had been there the whole time. We're still here. Observing and omnipotent, we are. The readers of this book. As far as the mosses are concerned, just a step down from God himself. This time, though, it is not only us who watches, but a creature far more vindictive than I would like to assume we're capable of being. As such, it is the actions of this merciless and voyeuristic creature that serve as the catalyst of the rest of this tale. Yes, we have reached the end, the final scene. Buckle your fucking seatbelt, people. This is it, the climax. It was a worm who was watching them, standing right next to where our invisible body would be. But this was not just any worm. This was the bifurcated halves of both the worm woman and the worm man, now fused together back into a singular beast, a Frankenstein's monster of beaten slime, refabricated from the ravaged love of our two main characters. Is this even biologically possible? Can two severed halves from two separate worms fuse together into one? Can they stalk and hunt, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, such as this worm was in the process of doing now? Look, if these are the kinds of questions you find yourself asking, and yet you've acknowledged any of the other logical incongruities and absurdities that preceded this moment, then you'll probably be displeased to know that, yes, this too is completely impossible. Scientifically speaking, this is not how worms work. And to extrapolate, this is not how relationships are supposed to work either. Guess what? Sometimes things don't have to work the way you think they should. You just have to accept it and move on. So here's what did happen. The worm halves met in the center of town. They rolled out of their unceremonious graves, one from a warehouse nightclub and the other from the house on Sycamore Lane, bloody and beaten and left for dead. They writhed blindly across this horrid landscape like fleshy steamrollers bound for head-on collision. And once they did collide, it was a consummation not unlike which Harrison and Tabitha just experienced, though this was a much more visceral and disturbing one in its display. Their bodies tangled up like the ropes that hung in the aisle of the hardware store. Like a knot, sliding down, getting tighter and tighter, a living noose feeding on itself. Skin melted into skin, Organs ensnare with other organs, intestines like lassos pulling each other closer and closer, until the delineation between she and he had lost all meaning, and their focus and thoughts became that of one mind and resolution to one singular and myopic goal, as all-consuming as it was simple. Destroy everything. 25. The worm plowed towards them, charging down the aisle. Its body was chaos, barely wrangled. The creature from the darkness had no use for love. Instead, it lusted for destruction. The worm's role was finally made clear. It was not made to be petty like Harrison and Tabitha. It was not subject to mood swings or emotional jaunts. It was not haunted by its past, by all of history behind it, but expectation, by the divorce between idealism and reality, and all the obfuscated places between, in which our human protagonist seems to constantly wallow. It was here to do one thing and one thing only. It was the worm, the eater of worlds, the king of the dirt, the jester of death. It slammed carelessly against the massive hardware racks lined up like labyrinth hedges on either side of them. They creaked as they wobbled back and forth before tumbling over like dominoes one into another. The worm did not care about the mess it made. Merchandise spilled all over the place, clattering to the ground in a cacophonic clap. Screwdrivers rained down on the Home Depot like holy nails thrown from heaven. "Harrison?" a nervous Tabitha said. "Is that—" "Don't think," her husband shouted, grabbing her by the hand. "Just run!" He pulled her behind him as the two of them took off running. When the end comes, what else can you do but run? Of course, they didn't get far. They didn't even make it out of the store. The worm moved as fluidly as the air itself. Harrison and Tabitha's clumsy legs couldn't carry them quickly enough. This thing had gained on them, terrorized them from behind, and there was nothing they could have done to stop it. In its wake, the worm left destruction, impersonal and cold. It cared not for the other insects and worms in the store, some of whom were impaled by the falling shrapnel or crushed beneath tiling scaffolds. It cared not for itself or its own well-being. Cuts and abrasions ran up and down its frame. Its putrid blood splashed against the concrete. This worm was a missile, honed in on its target. The reunited mosses desperately trying to escape it. The worm whipped itself forward, lunging like a boomerang, and wrapped the top half of its torso around Tabitha's ankles. She tripped, fell face first, the impact of her stomach mound sent her immediately into contractions. She was in labor. Amniotic fluid shot down her thighs, warm and pink. Whatever had rapidly grown inside her room was ready to come out. And the worm couldn't allow that. It wouldn't allow that. It was its job to make sure that new day never sees its dawn. It had been tasked by the universe, by the very laws of nature itself, to tear this couple apart, emotionally, then physically if need be. The worm wrapped up around her, a tornado of balmy flesh that whisked her away from her screaming husband. Harrison screaming, "No!" as it pulled her the rest of the way through the store and then out the front entrance. Back into the streets. It took off towards downtown. 26. Harrison burst through the front door of the Home Depot, spinning his head from left to right, searching for any signs of where Tabitha and her captor had gone. His skin felt hot and tight, like it wasn't skin at all, but rather a wetsuit he had been forced to squeeze into. His heart thudded in his chest, pumping spleen fruit sap through his veins. He heard his wife scream in the distance, an exasperated yip echoing across the cave, the acoustics making it seem like it was coming at him from all directions at once. Then there was a crash, then more commotion. He strained his leaf-filled ears until he was able to pinpoint its source. It was coming from the right. He looked. From here he could see the city skyline, beyond that the volcano sticking up taller than buildings like a giant, ashy finger. "I'm coming," he said to his wife, though she couldn't hear him. "I'm coming to rescue you." The worm held Tabitha so tight she could barely breathe. This was, of course, no concern for the worm. The creature had no concerns at all besides the most pressing and obvious one, which was to take Tabitha up to the top of the volcano and toss her inside. into the magma. You want to do what? Tabitha gasped as she read that last paragraph, and the monster's true intent was finally revealed to her. You're going to kill me? Yes, yes indeed it was. But why? Oh, Tabitha, silly Tabitha, naive Tabitha, soon-to-be-dead Tabitha, this is how the story ends. Come on now. You had to expect something like this, no? Why would I put a volcano in this book if I didn't intend to throw someone into it? I've alluded to it before. You know as well as I do there's no poetry in a story that ends with happily ever after. That's not how good literature works. You have to die. If anyone reading this is gonna feel vindicated, you have to die. I have to sacrifice you for them. What are you talking about? I don't give a fuck about people reading this, she cried out. I care about me. I care about my husband, my life. And you should care about me too, you all should. Can't you see I'm the main character? No, Tabitha, we're the main characters. All of us. The worms, the readers, the person reading the sentence right now. This is a story about readers. You and Harrison are just the tools I've employed in this allegory. You are the proxies onto which we can ascribe our own thoughts and feelings. You're not real. None of this is real. You look different in the mind of every person who imagines you. This city is built differently in every single person's head. Your body, your relationship, this entire fucking universe you inhabit. It's all just a fabrication. You are in no more real peril than the person reading this book is in real peril. You can't actually die because you never existed in the first place. It's not true. Chill ran down her cheek. Things I'm feeling are real. I'm just a character in a story you're not. I deserve better than this terrible, and we all deserve better than this. Worm made its way to the top of the volcano and held her out over the mouth of an open pit. The ground rumbled orange, and orange waves slopped and plopped in the bubbling inferno below. Tabitha closed her eyes and said goodbye. Goodbye. But then, stop! Her voice suddenly interrupted. The worm slowly turned. There stood Harrison right behind them. His body was overrun with gashes, thousands of microsplits out of which plant matter spilled, along with fingers, weird, knotty fingers. Fingers attached to the branches sticking awkwardly out of his skin. His feet dug into the ground, anchored themselves in the dirt. The hand that used to be a hand, and then was a shovel, and now was a series of dangling vines, longer than he was tall. He raised one of those vines and pointed it threateningly at the worm. Let her go, Harrison said, his normally ineffectual tone now replaced by a voice much deeper, much more confident. Perhaps it was the first sentence he had ever spoken that he actually believed in. It certainly sounded that way. The worm shook its head and looked at this shrub of a man with the kind of pity normally reserved for a sick animal. It was barely pity at all. There was something much more insidious woven into its movements. No, this wasn't pity. It was more like mockery. And the worm let go of Tabitha as she fell into the lava. As seed-addled as Harrison's mind may have been, his synapses were still firing all their cylinders, like a ray gun going, pew pew pew, and time seemed to slow down. This was not a moment that required any more contemplation, no more long-winded diatribes on the fleeting nature of love. It was too much contemplation that got them into this mess in the first place, second-guessing themselves, out of happiness, not knowing how fragile such a concept was. Stop thinking so hard, Harrison Moss. We don't need any more inner monologues. We need action! The worm smugly stood there, knowing it had won, that it would always win, that this was the natural order of things, and that people like Harrison and people like us, you and I, would come and go, would endlessly pass by, the death river flowing like an unending sieve, as the bottom of the food chain rises to the top, and the worms process both the princes and the paupers, the lovers and losers alike. And Harrison dove into the volcano after his wife. And then they both died. The end. 27. Okay. They didn't die. Not at that exact moment, at least. One day in the future, they will certainly perish, as do we all. But as for right now, what actually happened was this. The ground shook. Man, oh man, did the ground shake. It was an earthquake that seemed to come out of nowhere, but it was Richter tapping into a magnitude by which mankind had never seen. They'd have to invent a new unit of measurement just to classify an earthquake as severe as this. That's how strong it was. And why did this earthquake happen right then? It certainly wasn't fate or divine intervention, I'll tell you that much. It was more like luck. Because sometimes the earth shakes and you can't predict when or where or for how long or how hard. That's just how it is. So this moment was merely fortuitous. Perhaps it was too fortuitous to be believed. This is bullshit, you say. There just happened to be an earthquake right now at the most climactic part. Yeah, motherfucker, there was. The signs were there all along, foreshadowed throughout this whole book. If you knew where to look, you would have seen them. It's not my fault you don't understand subtext. So the ground shook, and the magma in the bowl of this volcano shook with it. And all that shaking caused the magma to do more peculiar things, like releasing big columns of pillaring steam. And before Harrison could even cross the threshold of this volcano's brim, one of those geysers of steam knocked him backwards onto his ass, back on the ground. The impact caused leaves to shoot out of his nose and mouth and ears in such profusion, he disappeared beneath the bush, and the ground shook harder. Pieces of the ceiling broke loose and fell. Mighty stalactites, millions of years old, crashed down to the surface below. The buildings surrounding the base of the mountain collapsed. They fell over as easily as dominoes pushed by a lazy child. Insects crushed up beneath the debris, worms tried to burrow and escape, but the rumbling ground exhumed them back to the top, only to be splattered alongside the rest of the vermin. There was no escaping this. Soon, downtown was nothing more than a pile of rubble, and then the ground split open, wide as a canyon, and the soil beneath it gave way. A gaping hole opened up. Another hole! But this one was deeper and blacker than the one Harrison and Tabitha doubled down the first time. The suburbs and the city, the ocean of blood that surrounded it, and the monstrous creatures that swam in its depths, all of it slid down into the chasm, into a newer, deeper level of earth completely obscured from our humble view. Everything fell away piece by piece, except for the erupting volcano, the worm, and the man who was standing on the edge of the volcano. Rim. Not even Tabitha could be counted among those still trapped in this collapsing cave, because as the volcano hissed and spat, a big fiery bubble formed in a boiling meniscus, growing bigger than a fiery bubble ought to grow, and then it popped, releasing a massive blast of rising steam. And sitting atop that column of invisible steam was Tabitha, her tiny body shooting upwards, a reverse meteorite heading towards the surface from inside of the earth. She rose quickly, too quickly to be seen, smashing through the upper crust that sealed off this domed city underneath the earth. Harrison blinked and she was gone. She passed through the sea, through the layers of sediment as if they were soft as marshmallow. The centrifugal force by which she was thrust left her burning hot and gasping for air, but when she burst through the ground back to the surface of the world she had come from, shooting upward ever still, the westward breeze now cooling her blistered skin to the point that frost formed on the tips of her toes. And she went higher, a contrail of smoke trailing behind her. She looked down and could see Sycamore Lane, the real Sycamore Lane that she had lived on with Harrison for so many years. Her home, her neighborhood around it, her entire life laid out below her like the last crumbs at a lunch buffet. She reached out for it, but she was rising too fast. In an instant it was reduced to nothing more than a speck beneath her. Then the city was reduced to a speck status beneath it, behind it, disappearing to a tiny point on the azimuth. The atmosphere that surrounded the globe was shaped like a cavern itself, but bigger. It protected the Earth from the harshness of space, sealing us all from the rest of the cosmos. In all those years under the sky, how had she not realized it? They'd always been trapped in the cave of sorts. The world presented itself to her in concentric circles, infinitely above it as it was below. The size of her cage merely one based on perspective. And right then her perspective was huge and getting wider the further away she traveled. Is there beauty in that? Maybe. But it was a question whose nuances Tabitha would have to ponder later. because as the air became thin and cold and she gasped for breath, and the blackness of outer space now reached down into the ionosphere to pull her forward with the same tenacity in which the fire below pushed her up, something else was happening to her body. And much like the earthquake that had just trembled beneath their feet, this event too can come at a moment suspiciously convenient, if not wholly unplanned. She was about to give birth. Meanwhile, still trapped under the ground, Harrison stood and watched helplessly as his wife once again disappeared beyond his grasp. He wanted to leap into the volcano again, to ride a different shaft of heat, like a leaf upon a zephyr, to the furthest annals of space, and beyond that if he had to, if that's where his wife had gone. He thought it'd be romantic, the ultimate sacrifice. But he knew that at this point, even if his plan worked and he wasn't incinerated, instantly in the viscous lava below, he would be behind her, chasing her, forever trying to catch up. That would not do. Not anymore. He realized then if he truly wanted to be with her, then it was time to step completely out of the routines and patterns they had dug for themselves. There was no longer any turning back. It was time to try something completely different, completely new. It was time to end this book in a way that would have been impossible to predict, even with all the painfully obvious metaphors I had left with you along the way. It was time to grow or die. And so, instead of actively fighting the seed that had been sprouting inside him, the seed he voluntarily swallowed for reasons that, until now, had not been totally clear to him, he decided to embrace it. He pushed, he flexed every fiber of his being, flexed so hard his skin completely split apart, shredding off him in sheets, tearing like wet paper towels, and a newer version of him expanded outward from the cocoon. He grew big, he grew fast. He was a spleen fruit tree, and he sprouted thousands of times faster than bamboo. His bark pulled taut against the dowels of his bones. His veins flowed with sanguine sap. His feet burrowed into the side of the volcano and down into its flaming basin. The lava not hot enough to penetrate his new husky shell, the magma nothing more than a puddle for a creature his size. His toes twisted their way down, filling up every inch of every channel with his expanding body, until they were hooked around the iron core at the center of the earth itself. The worm, who had once seemed so sinister and so in control, had been rendered almost microscopic in comparison to Harrison now. The threat it once presented was all but forgotten. We will not even mention it again. Fingers covered his massive arms, twisted fingers some 20 knuckles long. They were everywhere, millions of them, digging through the soil as Harrison forced them up through the ceiling of the cave, into the dirt above. From the ends of these fingers dangled fruit, purple and meaty, the shape and color of a human spleen. He continued to grow, doubling each passing second, and soon he filled the entire cavern, his back and shoulders pressed against the sides. There was nowhere left for him to go but out. Tabitha rocketed through outer space. Mars just passed her on the left. There went Jupiter on her right. She opened up her legs, spread them wide, straining harder than she'd ever strained before. She pushed, 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 and out it came. Her baby was born, except it wasn't a baby at all. The thing that slithered its way out of her womb was the only thing her and her husband's turbulent communion could have possibly created. She gave birth to a supermassive black hole. Tabitha passed out from the exertion. Giving birth to a supermassive black hole was a grueling and uncomfortable process. What's more, because there was no oxygen in space, and it's sub-freezing all the time, once Tabitha passed out, she was not going to wake up again. And because space was a vacuum and created no friction, she was still hurtling away from her former planet at the same speed in which the volcano had shot her. It's pretty crazy when you think about it, how we're all hurtling through space, the Earth and the Sun and the solar system and the entire galaxy as a whole, all moving so damn fast all the time. Harrison's spleen fruit trees grew in different directions. One to the left and one to the right, like magnets repelled from each other. They worked their way through the dirt until they came out of the ground at polar ends of the earth, Antipodes stretched across the x-axis of his torso. The arms rose up, much like the spleen fruit tree in the Moss's backyard had. And if these trees happened to spread out the yard of some other discontented couple, perhaps the forbidden fruit it bore would be as tempting as it had been to Harrison and Tabitha. Perhaps the worm, like the biblical snake, will whisper sweet lies in their weary heads. Perhaps they will pluck the fruit and they will eat it, and this whole fucked up story can go on repeating itself again and again for as long as the words I love you are able to gild themselves past human lips. Regardless, these arms reached up taller and thicker than any other trees before them. They cast shadows over neighborhoods that had never seen shadows before. They wrapped themselves around the planet like it was giving it a giant hug, and they braced themselves in the deepest parts of the ocean. They displaced water, sent tidal waves into coastal cities, washing away hundreds of thousands of lives, but this was no concern to Harrison. The forces of nature were beyond his control. Veins on the surface of his bark-like skin throbbed as he dug his fingers into the earth and pulled upward. He lifted his body into the dirt. Just like a worm himself, he was forced to swallow and shit out the soil in front of him. There was nowhere else for it to go but through him and out the other end. Miles he had to pull himself, up towards the surface. That earthquake was a preamble to the rumble the world experienced now. Miles he pulled and cities shook. And then he finally breached. His nose first, larger than a mountain now, followed soon by his lips, parting like a Grand Canyon, and his eyes, bigger than the two twin moons. He blinked and it sounded like thunder. He took a breath and the whole world trembled. Harrison had no time to enjoy the amenities the top side offered him. The fresh oxygen in a yellow sun, because his bride was flying across the vast reaches of space like a lost little comet, without an orbit to call its own. And even more, the supermassive black hole she could burst to had set up shop not too far away and begun the process of consuming everything in its vicinity, much in the way the hungriest worm would only ever aspire to. Tearing space apart on a molecular level, rearranging those bits in the mysterious and unsympathetic way that a black hole does, destroying the stars and the moons and the billions upon billions of worlds, splayed out across them like the lonely nodes in the cosmic game of Connect the Dots. This black hole was deeper and darker than Harrison had ever created before. Deeper and darker than he can fathom. It cared not for them or for anyone or anything. This was the hole, the final hole he had dug, the one from which there was truly no escape. The result of their tumultuous love containing every sadness and every joy, now bigger and stronger in everything it touched. Unstoppable. The earth shook apart, fell out of orbit, got sucked towards the vortex at the center of the insatiable dark thing. Harrison flapped his giant spleen fruit tree arms, trying to paddle this planet away from its inevitable destruction. But it was no use. He couldn't fight it. And out there, somewhere beyond his sight, Tabitha floated, bloated and blue and covered in ice. His body was still growing. How big was he going to get, he wondered. Under the crust of the hollow earth, his body, a countless mass of dirty roots and whispering tendrils, had filled up every inch, and Tabitha, bluer and colder still. God damn it! Harrison screamed, and his voice was so loud it could be heard by everyone, everywhere at the same time. Even beyond the fictional universe in which he existed, his voice carried beyond this storybook's lowly pages and floated through your head just now. You heard them, didn't you? You have to concentrate, really listen. This is happening all around you, happening to you. Just listen as he repeats himself. God damn it! He's crying out. You heard it that time, no? Well, even if you can't hear him, you can certainly feel him. He's digging the tips of his spleen fruit fingers into the ground, deeper. He is grabbing the ground with no more resistance than if he were to grab a loaf of bread. And he's screaming again. Yes, I know you can hear it this time, because it's not an actual scream, but a figurative one. His scream presents the feeling of every insecurity, every doubt you've ever had. It's not an actual noise. It's a whisper made from the darkest parts of your soul. You are full of his screams. You are made up of more of his screams and you are of yourself. He screamed and pulled. The terrain under her feet broke apart. Dirt danced and shimmied, but no worms surfaced from this relentless landscape. There were no worms anywhere. There was only us. We were the worms. The ground split open down the middle, the crack running like the equator all around. Harrison's two giant hands extended from the center of the earth, pulled and ripped the entire planet completely in half. The shell of the earth came apart as if it was merely glass. Chunks of land broke away and were thrown out into space. Entire continents were cast off the planet in an instant. And then the supermassive black hole swallowed up the remains. The leftover pieces of this eggshell Earth, sucked inside its insatiable dark belly. The nothingness inside the black hole, eternal and inevitable, growing stronger and more ferocious with every atom it consumed. But Harrison was free of the life underground that had imprisoned him for so long. Free of the surface even, that imprisoned him too, but in a different way. With no more land to call his home, he was his own planet now. About the size and the shape and of the one he had just sacrificed. Planet Harrison clawed his way across empty space, dragging his damaged, muddy body through the light years that separated Tabitha from him. Pain no longer mattered. It was there, of course, but he ignored it. He would endure this pain forever if need be. Until there she was, Tabitha. He had caught up to her. Her body is encased in ice, floating in front of him, finding within his massive grasp. He reached out and wrapped his giant spleen-fruit hands around her frozen frame. He pulled her close to him. She was almost invisible in comparison to his current stature, but as the only other being on planet Harrison's body, he knew she was there, even if he couldn't see her. He held her tight, up against his body. She lay on his surface like a glacier. Heat radiated out from its core, a kind of biological force that was somehow to sustain him once his body reached planetary status. If we could all be as big as planets, perhaps we could generate our own heat, too. The fire in him was faint, but he focused all his energy into it and pressed Tabitha's tiny carcass up against it, and slowly she thawed. The ice around her melted in thick droplets, filling the empty riverbeds and tributaries that covered his skin, and her blood flowed again the way it was supposed to, and her lungs pumped air, and her eyes opened glassy and wide, and she looked up at her celestial-sized husband with the same kind of tenderness she looked at the sunrise the morning after they had gotten married. "Harrison?" she said. "Yes, Tabitha." He saw lakes of tears rolling out of his asteroid eyes. "Yes, it's me." You're a planet now?" she said, slightly confused. "I destroyed the Earth," he said. "I had to save you." She sat up and looked backwards across all that empty space where the Earth used to float. In its place, these supermassive black holes swirled, distorting space-time all around it, sucking everything into its maw, destroying it forever. "Is that our baby?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "You were a mother. Congratulations." Tabitha frowned. "Is this the ending?" He nodded yes. "It seemed bittersweet." "Of course it is. If entropy is the state into which all things are eventually drawn, to allow love to flourish, to allow us to exist, we must be ready to fight the natural order." "It's too much." She stifled, beginning to sob. "It's too much to ask of people. We're expected to tear the universe apart in our wake, and for what? Have a slim chance at happiness?" Planet Harrison sighed and said, "Yes." And so it came to pass. A slim chance at happiness and they were afforded. Tabitha built a house on her husband's surface. It looked like the house they left behind on Sycamore Lane. She tilled Harrison's soil just like a worm. And in return, he grew for her the spleen fruit which sustained her. They still fought on occasion. They had good days and bad days, boring days and exciting ones. That's how it works. In the distance, the supermassive black hole still loomed. There was no getting rid of it. There were only moments like this where two lovers allowed themselves to be brought together just beyond its horizon. Perhaps in this new world, they will finally figure out who they really are deep down inside, find out what they have to truly offer to themselves and each other. It won't be easy. It never is. And so, as we close out this novel, I'm going to leave you with this simple epilogue. Not a moral exactly, but hopefully satisfying in some way nonetheless. Harrison and Tabitha Moss didn't necessarily live happily ever after, but god damn it, together they lived. The end.